Great. Let's get started today. Hello, everyone. My name is Mickey Burdick. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Delaware in Women and Gender Studies, and welcome to the first event of our 2024 to 2025 Religion and Reproduction Public Pedagogies project. So this virtual conversation series is sponsored by the Luce American Academy of Religion Advancing Public Scholarship Grant Program, and it's part of the Reproductive Righteousness Project as well. So the three of us pictured on the screen on the right are the series organizers, and we're really excited to bring experts like today on religion and reproduction into interdisciplinary conversations and to support a community of scholars, advocates, and practitioners on important, yet, as we know, often under-addressed topics. So we're really motivated to gather in this time, especially of intensifying hostility to reproductive, queer, trans, racialized, and other human rights issues, because we believe an open public discussion about these intersections of religion and reproductive politics is as urgent as ever. So like Risa mentioned, we'll be playing three different roles today. So Risa Cromer is our tech MC. So please send any messages directly to Risa if anyone is having any technical issues. And Leah here will introduce herself when she starts, and she'll be moderating the panel discussion. And I, Mickey, will kind of introduce this event and our speakers, and then also end with some more information about the speaker series that we're really excited about. So today, we're thrilled to have three experts who are highlighted on the side here, and you'll see throughout, with us today to discuss the diverse ways that faith leaders, past and present, interface with reproductive justice. So we just want to take a few minutes to introduce you to each speaker, and then we'll launch into our conversation for today. So first up, Reverend Kimberly Banks-Brown is a perennial student in the human services profession. She possesses a passion for equipping and empowering individuals to broader horizons and to live more fully into their higher selves. After earning an MBA with an emphasis in human resource management, a master's of divinity, and a master's in leadership and teaching, Kimberly is certain that the truest, most lasting transformation occurs in community. And I concur. She currently fills her time working with organizations around diversity and cultural competency, and sojourning with folks who seek to deepen their capacity for awe. We learned about Reverend Banks-Brown through her longstanding involvement with a group called Faith Aloud, a confidential spiritual care talk line dedicated to providing compassionate spiritual and religious support for people in all their decisions about pregnancy, parenting, abortion, as well as adoption. So welcome today, Reverend Banks-Brown. We're really excited you're here.
Thanks so much.
We also have here with us today Dr. Celene Ibrahim. Celene is a multidisciplinary scholar specializing in Islamic intellectual history, gender studies, and ethics. She currently is a faculty member at Groton School in the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy, where she also holds an appointment as the Muslim chaplain there. She's best known for her award-winning monograph, Women and Gender in the Quran, from 2020. She's also the author of Islam and Monotheism in 2022, an accessible primer on core Islamic beliefs. And she is also the editor of the anthology One Nation Indivisible, Seeking Liberty and Justice from the Pulpit to the Streets in 2019. The experts from that are also featured in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, and she writes about spiritual care, chaplaincy, religious leadership, and related themes for scholarly and popular audiences. So a really well-rounded, amazing scholar, and we're really excited that she's here with us today. So thank you, Dr. Celene Ibrahim. And last but not least is Dr. Gillian Frank. Gillian Frank is an assistant professor of history and gender and women's studies at Trinity College in Dublin. He's the author of numerous academic articles on the histories of sexuality, gender and religion, and public-facing scholarship. Through his column at The Revealer, More Than Missionary, Frank regularly writes about the intertwined histories of religion and reproductive rights. He's the co-editor of Devotions and Desires, Histories of Sexuality and Religion in the 20th Century United States, a favorite of mine, and is currently completing his manuscript called A Sacred Choice, Liberal Religion and the Struggle for Abortion Before Roe v. Wade, forthcoming with UNC Press. So you can listen to his podcast, another favorite of mine, Sexing History, which explores how the history of sexuality shapes our present. And you can get this wherever you stream your podcasts and shows. So thank you, Dr. Gillian Frank, for being with us today as well. And thank you all for joining us. We're really excited about this conversation and our future conversations to come.
Thank you, Mickey. My name is Leah Tarragon-Zeller, and I want to join Mickey in thanking our speakers for being here today and for all of you who have joined us on such important topics. I'd like to begin by facilitating a conversation between these three speakers, and then we're going to open up the floor for the rest of you participants. Please feel free in the meanwhile to put comments, questions in the chat at any point. So we're going to begin, and I'm going to start with my first question. First on my screen is Celene. So Celene, we're going to start with you and then work our way. So Celene, please tell us a bit about yourself and about your work. How did you come to focus on the intersections of religion and reproductive politics?
Thank you so much. I want to thank the sponsors and my fellow panelists. I look forward to our conversation today. And thank you so much to our hosts for bringing us together. So my work has two streams to it. One is the pastoral spiritual care dimension, and the other part is more of the academic study of religion dimension. And those two dimensions of the work speak to each other. And because of the urgency of this issue in our times, both politically and just in people's everyday lives, the topic sort of came to me rather than me necessarily seeking it out. But there's as we'll get as the conversation unfolds, there's somewhat of a confusing circumstance around jurisprudential issues around abortion, and somewhat of a need to develop a lot more pastoral resources as well. So I'm working on both sides of those issues to really help pregnant people, help families, and advance the scholarship along the lines of justice and equity.
Thank you, Celene. Kimberly, how did you get to these topics?
Well, I was a wayward seminary student, and someone mentioned something about folks who were in reproductive crisis who needed support. And it was Faith Aloud at that time was a standalone entity. It's now a part of a nation, really great organization called All Options. But at the time, it was a organization that sought to support people in reproductive crisis. And so as a seminary student, I began to study under Reverend Becky Turner, who I consider the spiritual care guru. And from there, once I was ordained and then got involved in not only supporting students, people on the talk line and connecting them with services, but then also helping to share my experience with upcoming clergy and seminarians who were seeking to do the same.
Amazing. Both Celene and Kimberly, it kind of came to you.
Yes.
It did. Gil, share with us, how did you get to these topics?
Absolutely. So it also came to me in a way. So the body of my scholarship tries to look at how abortion rights movements, anti-abortion activism before and after Roe, and the racial and gender politics of anti-abortion and abortion rights movements, all of these seek to place Roe in the context of long-standing and ongoing debates in the histories of American religions, cultures, and politics. But more specifically, about a decade ago, I was mostly focused on anti-abortion movements, the religious politics of anti-abortion movements, and I was doing research in the archives in Michigan, looking at a referendum there, 1972, that sought to place abortion on the ballot, where voters came to the polls and were getting to vote, very familiar in today's context, on whether to enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution or reject it. Now, this was a story of Catholic and evangelical coalition building, one that we're very familiar with today. As I'm encountering this story of conservatism and religious repudiation of abortion rights, I started encountering voices that made almost no sense to me. Rabbis and mainline Protestant ministers, along with dissident Catholics, protesting at courthouses and state houses. Rabbis, or a rabbi in particular, getting arrested for helping get women across state lines to seek abortions, theologies of choice, an international abortion referral network. And I said to myself, what is this? This makes no sense with anything I've read before. It doesn't fit with what I've seen in the history books. This must be an anomaly. But I kept scratching my head and saying, it was eating at me. So I started to dig, oh, is this just a Michigan story and a Midwest story? And what I discovered was a story that spanned the United States and Canada, that brought it together with abortion referral networks in England and Japan and Mexico. And what I discovered was a group called the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, which helped somewhere between 250,000 to 500,000 women get abortions before Roe v. Wade, challenged abortion laws, built their own abortion clinics, one of which became the largest in the world. And so it was serendipitous that I discovered it. And I started interviewing these clergy, the women who they helped, the abortion providers who worked with them. So 150 or so oral histories later, we're at the end of the process. But what I've mapped is a story of liberal religion and their struggle for both contraceptive and abortion rights from 1920 up until Roe v. Wade. And so that's how I came to it, purely by accident, through a discovery in the archive that made me say, what is this? How can I tell this story?
Amazing accident. We cannot wait to read this all in your forthcoming book. Really, really inspiring. So I want to move on now that we're starting to get to know all of you. We would love to hear what role reproductive justice plays in your research, in your spiritual practice, community engagement, advocacy, and any other kind of related activities, because we have such a wide array of people who are trying to navigate these topics. Some are in academia, some are in chaplaincy, other types of ways. So in whichever ways you would like to share with us, we would love to hear how these ideas about reproductive justice are informing what it is that you do.
Should we go in the same order? Would you like to mix?
Go for it, Celene.
I'll talk first from the pastoral care standpoint, and I'm primarily thinking about my own religious leadership in the context of the United States, of North America more broadly. But one of the factors and features of being in Muslim religious leadership in the States is that we do have Muslims from every corner of the globe in so many different communities, oftentimes pulled together in education settings and even in local communities, trying to figure out ways to navigate their differences of opinion and differences of approach on this issue and many others. And so in this context, the work is about helping individuals one-on-one discern what are their commitments Islamically in terms of ethics or jurisprudence, how to navigate their family situation around the various pressures that they might have in one direction or another, but also just helping people sort through the myriad advice that is out there that is oftentimes coming to them just via Google searches rather than an actual human being to sit across the table with, or in a comfortable space to process, right? And so this reproductive justice issues are actually one of many issues in which a certain restructuring of what community looks like, what religious leadership looks like as a religious minority in this multiracial, I hesitate to use the word sect, but multi-affiliation, these settings with multiple religious affiliations under the umbrella of Muslim. So this is how I'm thinking about my work on a one-to-one, on a more pastoral basis. When we come to academia, I'm thinking in terms of mainly the history of jurisprudence or discourses in Islamic ethics, the ways in which they've had continuity from the early Islamic period through the classical period and the pre-modern period and into the present. And many times in this academic sphere, I'm trying to pull out threads that have been buried throughout the centuries or question the logical coherence of certain ideas, or I'm trying to lift up, in particular across the body of my work, but on this issue, the idea of women's well-being, which is not necessarily a like well-being, a holistic version of well-being is not necessarily factored into jurisprudential or even ethical conversations. And so I'm thinking a lot about how to reframe ethical and legal discourses around what is harm, and the primary axiomatic objective in our tradition to minimize harm. So, both on both sides, this one-on-one pastoral approach and thinking historically, ethically with the tradition, because I do situate myself as having received a legacy that I'm grappling with and that I'm trying to responsibly pass on. So that's a bit, and I'm sure we'll get into some more specifics, but just in terms of juggling the various balls in the air.
Yeah, thank you so much for setting that out for us, both your pastoral work and the more intellectual work, which really seem to inform one another. And I was thinking while you were talking about kind of pulling out those threads about Gillian's experience in that archive, that often what we do is really look for those things that may have been buried but are nevertheless part of our traditions. Thank you, Celene. I think we're still going in order. So Kimberly, we'll go crazy on the next round, but Kimberly, go for it.
Well, Celene, I know that your second half was your academic response, but I felt like I was in church, and I just wanted to say preach at a couple of times, and we're not even the same religion, but that really, it was a great segue into how reproductive justice plays a part in my spiritual practice, and it just comes down to the justice. The reality is that a lot, as a Protestant clergy, there are a lot of mainstream, notable mainstream denominations who support a woman's right to choose, and who advocate for that. However, for marginalized communities, religion often plays a large part in their lives, and is not just a religious source, but an authoritative source over their lives in general. And unfortunately, they don't receive the support that they deserve. Their right to choose is not supported. And so for me, in my work and working with folks who call from all of these different walks of faith, is being able to try to, as you say, talk about the welfare of women, which is not always a high priority in some religions, and especially in what they would call the lesser Protestant denominations, and to even begin that conversation with women or people who are contemplating reproductive choices as such a tender moment. So my work is kind of twofold. One, when I'm assisting people who are in these six predicaments, but also when I'm in pulpits or Bible studies or conversations, and to say, hey, so, where do women rank in this congregation? And where does their welfare rank? And who has sovereign rule over this woman's body? And is that justice? And as a Protestant, I often use the word Jesus follower as opposed to Christian, because the Jesus movement was about justice, right? And so we cannot talk about justice yet want to systematically oppress these. So I'm going to, and with that, I'll just remember, I'm a pastor. So at any time, just cut my mic off. Anytime, Leah.
Like you said to me.
I want to hear so much more from both of you, but we're going to go to Gillian, and then we will continue.
Thank you. I would pity the person who tried to cut off any of the people on here. What I want to begin with is a premise building off of what Celene and Kimberly said. They both mentioned the pastoral and that as being an integral part of their work. And so what I try to look at is how the history of pastoral care, and I come with the premise that the pastoral is political, much as the personal is. And so this history of offering pastoral care to abortion seekers begins really in the 1920s with those who tried to help the family planners around contraception. By the 1940s and 1950s, clergy increasingly encounter women desperate to end their pregnancies, and there are no means for them to do so. The ability to get a safe and legal abortion is only in the most extenuating of circumstances, which is to say, threatening the life of the pregnant person, what they called the life of the mother at that time. And so clergy increasingly encounter stories of utter desperation, stories of those in their communities, their congregations, sometimes in their families with their loved ones, who want to terminate a pregnancy, who do so through the most abhorrent of circumstances, through predatory abortion providers, or through the most expensive of circumstances, having to travel abroad or to pay what would be the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today to terminate a pregnancy. And they are developing a theology and an ethos of pastoral care to help them empower themselves. They're not saying these women belong in the house. They're saying, how do we actualize their choices and desires? And that has a whole history, and it becomes institutionalized in a number of contexts. So part of my work is to excavate that. Now, the question was about reproductive justice. And so Sister Song's definition is about the right of personal autonomy, the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent children we have in safe and sustainable communities. The question that many of the clergy I studied before Roe encountered was, how do you do that in a context of criminalization? How do you do that when resources for abortion seekers are few and far between? How do you make these resources, and by resources I mean medical providers, the means to travel to them, the means to pay for the abortion, the means to stay there, the informational resources, how do you make that available? Not just to the middle class and wealthy, many of whom who had no means of accessing this and were in information and medical deserts as well, but the least among us. And so my work tries to offer a history of what we now call reproductive justice, those who recognize the systemic oppression along reproduction for pregnant people and those who love them, the ways in which economics created vast disparities, and the ways in which information deserts were perpetuated by the state. False information, misleading information, or a lack of information which was criminalized, a right to share in the pastoral context. Where do you go when you're pregnant and you don't want to be? So my work focuses on how those clergy, those religious people, produced their own resources, whether it was offering pastoral counseling in the context of synagogues and churches, whether it was creating information networks and abortion referral networks. So reproductive justice will look different under different circumstances. In the particular extenuating circumstances pre-Roe, which are being replicated today in many states, also being resisted in many states, that meant just giving the basics. We are here. We are going to offer you information. We are going to get you from point A to point B. And if we can, we'll offer a little money to help you along the way. But that lack of economic support made all the difference. And so just by way of context, and I'll stop talking myself, the huge difference in allowing women of color and poor women access to abortion and contraception was both legalization and the building of bricks and mortar institutions that were local. And local was the key. So in 1970, when New York State legalizes, in 1969, when it becomes opened up in California, we see a huge influx of people of color and poor people into clergy-run and also public-run institutions. And that was the game changer. Now, we can talk about reproductive justice and all these freedoms, but the old phrase is freedom is not enough. We need resources to make it tangible, material, and concrete. And so that's the history I excavate through the frame of reproductive justice.
Thank you all three for taking us from the present to the past and to these questions and issues that seem so relevant now and then and in between. I love that pastoral is political, and I love to try to hear about the ways that you are all trying to develop frameworks, languages, and metaphors, discourses to speak about reproductive justice, each in your own ways. I'd like to ask now about the ways your work speak to gaps in dominant conversations today around religion and reproduction. And you've touched it a little bit during this conversation already, but I'm thinking about questions about misconceptions, which you both spoke about. What types of misconceptions about religion and reproduction or reproduction does your work address? What would you really like people to know or to better understand today? So we're going to go in a different order. Kimberly, do you want to go first?
Thank you. I hope this, I'm going to try to hope that this relates back. So what I like to talk about is, why is it a question if a pregnant person has the authority or right to decide what they're going to do, right? And that takes us back to how women are viewed in a lot of religious communities. And so when I am, not when I'm with the person who's in crisis, obviously, but when I'm with congregations or small groups or even other clergy, I really talk about, I try to root the reproductive justice conversation in the conversation of gender equality, period, right? That we're not having conversations about if persons should have vasectomies. We're not having conversations about if persons should be allowed to utilize or access Viagra. We're not having conversations. Why are all the conversations centered around people who are assigned female at birth? And what are we as clergy doing to either perpetuate those types of conversations or to interrupt them, right? And we can't have justice roll down like waters for only half of the people or a third of the people. And so the justice, I really focus on the justice portion of, if there is no justice, there is no peace. And more importantly, we can't have a piece of justice. It has to be for everybody. It can't just be segmented to a certain group. And I'll stop there because I can't wait to hear what my fellow panelists have to say.
Okay, thank you so much, Kimberly. So we're going to change the order. So Gil, why don't you go, and then Celene?
Sure. So I'm going to speak to both a popular and a historical narrative. And it's one that everyone in the room, all the participants, work to counter, but it's a prevalent one, which is to say that religion and reproductive rights are like oil and holy water. It's just that the twain shall not meet. And my own work tries to correct a historical record. Now, I'm not saying I'm doing this alone. There are other scholars, Rachel Cranston, Samira Mehta, and others in Jewish studies, many others who are doing this in the history of Protestantism and other denominations, trying to show that there has been an ongoing commitment among religious people to reproductive rights. But to hear the media tell it, to hear politicians tell it, to hear the historical record up until very recently tell it, religious folks were at the margins. If they were there, they were incidental or unexplained. They were silenced. What does it mean when there's a group of predominantly men offering reproductive assistance? Does that belong in the history of feminism? Or shall we focus on a very flashy other story about reproductive justice? So my work tries to correct the record in many ways by putting religion at the center, to suggest that the language that we view as secular, that of choice, that of justice, also has religious roots, has religious inflections, that we can see it in the participation of religious groups in cases from Griswold v. Connecticut to Doe v. Bolton, which was the sister case of Roe v. Wade, and countless other legal cases in between. That the language that we have of choice and sovereignty and autonomy, or as they might phrase it, dominion over one's own body, has religious antecedents and was rooted in people of faith. And so the story that the religious right has told for a long time, the popular story that religion opposes, says no to abortion, says no to female autonomy, is a self-serving story. Now, there's a reason that that story became dominant. After Roe, a lot of religious folks who are very active in the movement went on to the next fire. Clergy go to where they're most urgently needed oftentimes. Many stayed in the movement. But at that very moment of denominational decline for both Jews and Protestants, at that moment where evangelicals and Catholics are taking center stage in a conservative coalition and speaking loudly about abortion, they took the oxygen out of the room. And it's also at that very moment where historians, women's historians of sexuality, are coming to their own as a field, and the loudest voices in the room are these conservative, anti-abortion religious activists. And they skewed the narrative. And media literacy and religious literacy, there needs to be a better conversation among the two, particularly religious literacy among media folks, who will go to this flashy story. So periodically we'll hear stories about the clergy consultation service or other people of faith who support reproductive rights. But oftentimes, the very well-funded conservative groups have been able to perpetuate a story for those who don't know much about religions, plural, religious traditions, again, plural, that support reproductive rights, or the nuances amongst religions groups that have mixed viewpoints about contraceptive and abortion access. And so part of my own work is to try to invite people into a more nuanced history and conversation, and to suggest that the politicized and often self-serving history of religious people aren't here when we talk about reproductive justice, is one that has benefited certain folks so that they can continue to say in states like Indiana or Texas, God says no to abortion, and that others who support it, they have no historical or theological standing or precedent.
I'm admiring my fellow panelists' ability to condense what is such a complicated history and landscape into 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm going to try to do the same here. The first question is the idea of abortion itself, and that this term is actually defined differently for different groups of Muslims. And so oftentimes you'll see Muslims come out with statements that abortion is impermissible, or they use the word haram, meaning not divinely sanctioned or not in Islamic jurisprudence. But there's also some of those same people use the phrase termination of pregnancy to mean, in an Islamic jurisprudential framework, a legitimate, a sanctioned termination of pregnancy. So even the terminology is very confusing, I think, for lay Muslims who are trying to navigate through. And bear in mind too that when I'm thinking about Muslim networks, I'm thinking about what is happening over vastly different regions as well, and people are have their own ways, their own languages to refer to processes of termination of pregnancy and miscarriage. And so there's also a linguistic hurdle that we're in the process of trying to overcome, just to get some clarity. Now, what we also find at the same time is that, as with many issues, very early Islamic sources allow for much more flexibility and permissibility, and that over time, as discourses become codified and as schools of thought become coalesced around particular figures, some of that nuance gets lost. And so in the contemporary period, even more nuance gets lost, because oftentimes Muslims who see themselves as traditional or religiously conservative will simply say, oh, well, what are other religious conservative groups doing, thinking? What are the theologies that are being expressed, and kind of adopting that onto the Muslim framework, even though there's really important, significant differences. And so when we look at jurisprudential sources, there's a dispute, a debate that's an ongoing one between different schools of thought around this idea of ensoulment. And the idea of ensoulment is that the ruh, which is the Hebrew cognate, there's a verse in the Quran that talks about the divine blowing into the human being, this ruh. And so many of the discourses in Islamic thinking about the permissibility of terminating a pregnancy, either due to some medical reason or otherwise, have to do with the idea of ensoulment. Now, unfortunately, the jurisprudential discourse is almost what dominates. So if you search this issue on YouTube, you're not necessarily going to hit on pastoral resources for thinking. You're going to hit about debates. Is it 40 days ensoulment? Is it 120 days ensoulment? And either way, that window, even 120 days, is not actually very long into a pregnancy. A whole lot can happen after 120 days. And we have to also, in the Islamic point of view, and what I keep trying to introduce to fellow religious leaders, is that the ways in which early Muslims, classical thinkers, pre-modern thinkers, their ability to understand, to access the sophisticated medical technologies, they were not working in the same context as we are today. And the context, the complications that individuals face when they're making these decisions, we can't just reduce this conversation to simplistic numeric formulas. And it does, these numbers don't even take into consideration that a lot of pregnant people don't actually know when they became pregnant, what day it is. It's just, to my mind, as well-intentioned as it may be, it's very impractical and pastorally not useful always. So here's the other kind of complexity I want to put into this. So the Quran has many verses that talk about not killing one's children. And the word for children is always used walad. And walad in Arabic means you are born, walad, to be born. And many of the people who argue for the most restrictive abortion access are taking verses of the Quran that speak about children that have already been born and infanticide and reading these onto a fetus. And this is, in my mind, a problematic jump of interpretation. Last thing I'll just throw out is the idea of life being sacred. In general, we have this principle in Islamic sources. But this principle is used to make the most restrictive, put out the most restrictive abortion guidance, when we could also go to many other axiomatic ideas within the tradition around, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but I think it's incredibly important, around avoiding harm, around a jurisprudential maximum that says things are permissible unless explicitly forbidden. And there's many ways to think about the permissibility in various circumstances. Choice is not a framework that will necessarily resonate from an Islamic consciousness. The religion is called submission, and so choice, it's really hard to get a lot of traction on that ground. But what I've been using the phrase, and this is in consultation with other spiritual care practitioners, around discernment, kind of instead of putting the language of choice forward, because although there's some similarities in this, but discernment seems to indicate this informed process that includes spiritual, ethical deliberation. So that's where I'm at, in short.
Wow, you have all given us so much to think about. And before I go on to another question, I just want to comment and say how important language seems to be in all of these conversations. This type of secular knowledge about autonomy and about choice versus other ways of thinking about sometimes very similar things. A lot of the things that you spoke about resonates with a lot of my own work on family planning, which I'm not going to get into now, but it was fascinating to listen to you really beg us, both as scholars, as activists, and just as human beings, to look at these kind of plural religious traditions and try to find a language that works, whether it's a language of, you spoke about avoiding harm and you spoke about justice and, different ways that these are part of traditions and they have a long history, as Gil was telling us. But sometimes today these languages aren't used, and it seems to me that you're trying to bring life and bring these languages back, which is a fascinating project. So I want to ask our last question before we open up to the participants, and I can see that there's a lot of questions coming in. What do you see as the main challenges, but also opportunities for realizing the goals your work sets out to achieve? So we would love to hear from the three of you some concrete examples from your own experiences about challenges and opportunities working, um, each of you in your own work. I think we're going to start with you, Gil, this time for sake of equality to all.
All right, I'll take it. So part of, as a historian, the challenge is what is in the archives and what isn't in the archives, archival silences. And so I began this project. Many of my subjects were septuagenarians, octogenarians. I interviewed one 99-year-old. And so capturing the voices and recovering the sources has been a primary challenge in telling the story. Happily, there have been a couple of big archives, one in New York, one in Illinois, that was able to get me started, and then I was able to dig in and get more. But I used oral histories as a way of filling in the many gaps. The loudest, the most easy voices, the easiest voices to find were clergy. They were named in the archival sources. I could find many of them, those that were still alive, many were willing to speak to me. Abortion providers proved to be the next challenge. Many of them, their names were encoded, were not given properly, and so finding them, recovering them, tracking them down, I was able to get some of them. The hardest by far was the abortion seekers themselves. And for ethical reasons, I couldn't reach out and contact them, because even though I could recover some of their names from the archives, from personal letters that rabbis and ministers kept over the years, some redacted, some not, you don't go seek out the names of people or seek out the people who sought out these procedures. And so I've been lucky that over the years when I've written in public-facing ways, some of them have volunteered to share their stories with me. But overall, I've collected probably less than 24 of their stories. I have their stories through the primary sources and letters they've written, but by far the biggest constituency, we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who engaged with this religious formation and religious service, their experiences were often fleeting, lost to the archives, or shared in personal stories, but for the most part, gone. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges to understanding the scope of religious impact and religious experience. Now, let me be clear. Many of the folks who use this service might not have identified as religious, might have come from other religious traditions. Catholics, by far, were one of the biggest users of the clergy consultation service. They voted with their feet in terms of their use of contraception and abortion. What are their stories? Some of them I know, but for the most part, vanished. And so I think when I share a history, I'm cognizant of the fact that it is incredibly partial, and that the story of the users I can reproduce only to a certain extent because of ethical, privacy issues, and the ways in which the archive produces and reproduces silences.
Gil, thank you so much. I'm usually very jealous of historians, but it's also such a complicated thing to go and find those silences and those partial stories and put them together. Really, what a challenge. Celene, I think we're going to you. Would love to hear about challenges and opportunities. You've already shared some, but if you want to offer some more concrete examples, we would love to hear.
Right. So I did want to share something concrete, which is a wonderful resource from my colleague who's an occupational therapist and also very well educated and grounded in Islamic sources. And her practice is called Sexual Health for Muslims. And again, she's also working one-on-one, but putting out public-facing content as well. And the challenge is, speaking of biological ethics, I sort of want to just clone her and because how do we scale? And for me as an academic, then I'm also, one of the challenges, but one of the exciting horizons is exactly what I think we're doing here today with the grant, is translating scholarship into wider public understanding. And to do that, maintaining the nuance, but also in a way that's easily digestible for people who are busy or just getting the people who need it. Gil, as your work is speaking to getting the people who need the information, the information. So it's both a challenge, but it's an opportunity. And one of the other wonderful opportunities, I'm going to shout out another colleague here who's a midwife, who comes at midwifery with a very spiritually rooted consciousness, as I think many midwives do. And here we have another area, talk about the silences, that has, I think, for peoples across the world, been a really important point of reproductive knowledge being passed down through generations. And I'm excited to see the field, whether it's support doulas or midwives. And I put in the chat Baraka birth because my colleague Christina is also focused on underserved communities and trying to make sure, again, Gil, as you were reminding us, that there is an economic dimension to access that is at the center maybe of one of the justice issues involved in this. So those are some of the challenges, but also exciting points. There's more I can mention, but we'll pass it over.
Celene, thank you so much. Kimberly, please share with us.
Yes, so with my primary interaction and focus being with persons who are actually in the midst of some type of reproductive issue or crisis, what comes to mind are the words of author, poet, I consider prophet, Alice Walker, through her character, Shug Avery in The Color Purple, when she says, I think it pisses God off when people walk past the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. And in my experience, that's really the greatest obstacle, is people don't want to piss God off. And they have been indoctrinated, brainwashed, reared, whatever word you want to use, to believe that that's exactly what they're going to do. Not so much if they don't carry the term, if they don't not adopt, but if they don't do what others think is best for them to do. And that other might be their clergy, their congregation, their partner, their family, their whatever, right? Because women have been subjugated for so long and to such a point where many don't recognize it. And this is an instance where women are at the top of the totem pole, right? Let's not talk about non-binary folks who are in crisis. Let's not dare talk about a trans person who is in crisis, right? And so the fear of not wanting to piss off your landlord, your supervisor, your sole provider is the real challenge that I encounter when I'm in the line with people. I've had people say to me, I don't want to make God mad. Say those words. And what do you say to that? So by far, just the continued conversations with the people in these religious authoritative positions, creating these narratives and feeding people these is definitely the biggest challenge. The biggest opportunity, or as I like to use the language I use, the biggest hope, is that at 1 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, I'm sitting on a panel with folks who chose to do this, right? With you, with Leah and Risa and Nikki and all of these people who said, hey, it's time. The optimism comes in the form of academia. okay? Because as we educate, even if I don't understand, it helps to create a question. And those questions are now coming up in communities of faith. And so while I feel like the biggest challenge kind of falls, and guess I can say this because I'm a clergy within communities of faith, I also believe that with as faith believers and faith wars and people of all faith traditions begin to pay more attention to academia, be involved, pastoral as politics. Unfortunately, all of these horrible shenanigans in denying people rights have caused questions and conversations. And some of them have come in the form of, what do I do? I want to say something, I want to do something, but I don't want to piss my little God off, whether that's my pastor or my priest or whoever the case may be. So I'm just so grateful that you all have this series going and this forum is here and those folks are here, because this, to me, is the greatest hope of this movement.
I just really want to get in and underscore, Kimberly, what you've said there. I've started to use the term in my own work, spiritual abuse, and thinking about this not only around coercion, around unwanted sexual advances, or encouraging people to stay in unhealthy domestic situations, but also spiritual abuse around reproductive issues as well. So I think it's really helpful as kind of people who are thinking about how to shape the discourse, that we continue to articulate the line between what is pastoral guidance and what is actually coercion and becomes spiritually abusive.
I'm going to add on to say that this is a long-standing conversation among religious leaders, amongst people who are offering pastoral care. In one of the clergy consultation service guidebooks from probably late 1960s, early 1970s, they talk to each other about how do we engage with folks from other religious traditions who have come to us after being shamed, after being told that they are going to hell, after being told that they are evil for doing this. How do we offer them support and love and care? And they had a whole program for affirming them, to let them come out of the meeting, in their words, feeling affirmed and restored. And so this has been an ongoing conversation. And the negotiation that they had to do was, how do we do it in a way that doesn't tell them, and some were better than others at this, that their religious tradition is wrong, and try to do it in a non-conversion way. And so how to walk that fine line. Some also said, I want you to go back to your church and bring with them a message of hope and our own personal view. And so, but there is a history there of inter and intra-faith dialogue and contact. And what do you do when you encounter, not only from your own tradition, but others, that differing message? And so this is a long-standing discourse and debate and problematic that religious folks have been dealing with.
We really picked the most amazing speakers to begin our speaker series. Thank you for such thought-provoking thoughts, work, and life, really. I have so many questions, but I will open up the floor. I know that a lot of people have put some questions in. This is a time to look back at this talk. It's really amazing to me how we began with all three of you saying, we kind of just came across this in the archive, in real life, and look what an amazing journey this has been. And I'm sure you're still very much amidst these journeys, developing discourses, ways to navigate and really offer an alternative to this idea. What did you say, Gil? They shall not meet, right? Thinking about religious, spiritual ways to think about reproductive justice historically and in the present, really so fascinating. So please feel free to put some questions in the chat box and I will try to pick some out. And if people want to ask their questions and add to them, this is the time. Risa, Mickey, do you want to help? Because I have not really looked at the chat.
Yeah, I have been monitoring. We have a number of questions and contributions, so we'll try to summarize and represent in the words of our posters here, and just another invitation for those is you who have burning and budding thoughts, please plop them in. And I'll try to connect them together so that we have some coherence here. But one of the things is that there's been prominent discussion here around abortion and pregnancy decision-making, as well as family planning and contraception. And we know that the founders and teachers of reproductive justice teach us that justice matters reach far beyond those particular aspects and parts of the broader umbrella of reproductive health, rights, and justice. And there's been some gestures to this. Celene mentioned midwifery, spiritual practice, and Kimberly is talking about gender equity as an essential and elemental root here for addressing broader issues. And so there's a question here about what are some other aspects of reproductive experiences or the politicization of religion with respect to reproduction that has found you or calls you in your work. One of our posters is particularly curious about how your work may have intersected with topics around assisted reproduction. So just want to open this up for some thoughts that you might have.
I can speak to that a little bit, especially in the domain of assisted reproduction. So many of the abortion providers that were within this network, or not many, but a significant amount, went on from offering reproductive health care, which is, say, abortion provision, to offering basically to help lesbian couples get pregnant in the early 1970s. So there was a continuum between those who are willing to offer reproductive health care and abortion to those who are willing to help queer people become pregnant. And there's a history there that has yet to be written. I'm not going to be writing that per se, but I think looking at those who are offering early sorts of family planning for queer communities, what was their ethos? Why were they willing to do that? So that's just my little flash from the archive, one of those stray thoughts that won't necessarily make it into the book, but might make a think piece at some point.
Thank you. Kimberly, Celene, any thoughts?
I'm thinking a lot about access to healthcare as a justice issue that might be easier to form coalitions around. And in the Islamic tradition, we do have fairly lax in comparison rules around contraception. So it's fairly easy for someone in religious leadership to take, if they would like to be proactive around justice issues related to reproductive health, that access to contraception, to safe and effective contraception is one of those areas that doesn't have to be a political, too much of a political, politically fraught endeavor. Although I maybe need to backtrack on what is or what is not going to be politically fraught. But that just seems like it's a base level entry point that could be a point of collaboration and coalition building. In the Muslim context and across maybe some denominations of Christian and Muslim Jewish and broader. The other thing I'm thinking about in this domain is how in these climates where there's pressure, and I'm thinking beyond the US, but the impetus to regulate at the state level, at a federal level, or at the level of a constitution, where in religious discourses can we start to separate out individual discernment on medical issues from the politicization around rights? And it seems like that might be almost impossible in the US context, but there's a lot of places I could look to around the world where this really is considered a health and a personal ethical decision. And so not everywhere in Muslim context is it politicized to the extent that it has become in the United States. And so kind of looking at what are the dynamics that allowed reproductive health choices to remain in the sphere of medicine and kind of personal ethics. But I do get worried because I see proposals for from different places in Muslim majority societies for almost like commissions that are going to regulate where a pregnant person seeking an abortion will have to have like 3 different doctors certify that this person's life is in danger and grave, right? The stakes have just been ratcheted up, and the bureaucratic proposals around that are so ratcheted up in some places. So we see 2 extremes, and like, what are the mechanisms by which we can give people more, I'm going to use my word, discernment?
Kimberly, would you like to add something, or should we move to another question? What would you prefer?
We could just move to another one.
Mickey, Risa?
Yeah, so we talked there's been some questions in the chat about sort of dominant voices and powers around religiosity and reproduction, especially under these dominant voices that just happen to be louder than others. Maybe we don't pull out the history of the more nuanced kinds of things going on. I'm curious, and you talked a lot about sort of, how we can, in a scholarly way, do this, right? We can not change these histories, but talk about them, exhume them from the archive, reframe justice and pastoral care. But I'm wondering, and so are some of the people in our chat, what you wish maybe other progressive religious leaders or those within your denominations might do to kind of combat these for instance, stereotypes about things like Protestantism and maybe these all too simple stories about power and patriarchy, those sorts of things. What do you do sort of, I mean, you can answer theoretically, but also practically about what you think that these religious leaders might do to kind of go over the loudness of those against reproductive freedom and justice?
I'll start. While academics and academia, makes me feel emotive. That probably doesn't happen for most people. So the reality is that in communities of faith, we are addressing or appealing to people's emotions, right? And that's one aspect that academia doesn't necessarily hit for most people. And so when we talk about the loud voices, those voices have a lot of emotion, right? And emotion will carry a message, unfortunately, further than accuracy, right? So in a practical, I'm at my synagogue, I'm in my mosque, I'm at my church, for progressive leaders to utilize language, again, she who names the world owns the world, to utilize language to say abortion in your communities of faith, to use language that we have learned, to use fetus or embryo, to actually begin to utilize language that is concrete and not just that which appeals to my tradition or my heartstrings, but that religious leaders begin to understand that to care for your flock means to care for the whole person. And that means to introduce and expose and elevate the way that they see experiences and give them more practical ways to articulate their experiences and move away from the language of condemnation. I love your word, Celene, of discernment, right? That is a term that is like golden. And it is a common term in the Protestant tradition. So it would be a really good tool, right? A really good pivot, a really good fulcrum to be able to say, okay, let's talk about that. So in short, yes, my challenge to fellow religious leaders is to seek to appeal to not just the heart, but to the prefrontal cortex of our people as well.
To underscore again some of the things you said, that's exactly where my mind went as well, is that religious leaders, the more they can articulate what is at stake for people when they have healthcare needs and cannot get them, and if these stories are traumatic, they're graphic, but people have to understand what is at stake, because some people have not encountered it in their own lives and can't, muster up that sense of like empathy, for someone in this situation. And I think finding the platforms that religious leaders can talk openly without feeling like they're also hedging. If I say this, then I'm going to lose my credibility in these circles that I want to be in. And so that's what I see happening in the Muslim community. No one wants to venture outside of the lines that are will not get you in trouble, will not have you your credibility questioned. And this is just, it's too urgent of an issue not to get more specific, and even to the extent that people who have had these traumatic experiences, we don't want to re-traumatize people in telling their stories, but sometimes that is actually what moves other people to be able to have compassion and empathy, and to see this as a priority to mobilize around.
So I am a historian. I'm not a presentist in many ways, or I am, but I try not to be in public. So I'm going to suggest a couple of things as avenues for research to reframe our narrative. 52 years ago, in 1972, during the presidential election, there were two referenda on abortion, one in Michigan, one in North Dakota, and the anti-abortion forces, which were largely religiously funded and organized, won profoundly by huge margins. Now, let's fast forward to the post-Dobbs moment, where ballot initiative after ballot initiative in places like Ohio, Kansas, Michigan, we have one coming up in Texas, and a whole slate of other states in the upcoming election, abortion rights activists have won by significant margins. What has happened to allow this? It cannot surely just be a decline of religion, and we know, in fact, that is not the case. That religious activists have been front and center in mobilizing people in these ballot initiatives, and people of faith have supported abortion rights in the voting booth. So I think the story about the loudest voices in the room, which is to say anti-abortion activists, whether they're conservative Catholics or evangelicals, are coming quickly to realize that their views are not popular views. They may be loud views, but perhaps they've been a paper tiger for quite a while now. And so I think that our sociologists, our anthropologists, future historians, other forms of scholars, media scholars and such like, religious studies folks, need to get on to figuring out what has happened, what is happening right now. We see religious activists at the front lines of moving people from, we can call them medical deserts, we can call it the places where abortion is banned right now, getting them across state lines to receive services now, at the front and center of advocacy. And then in many ways, in places like Ohio, Texas, and others, they were anticipating Dobbs and were preparing for it, and were in many ways the front lines. So I think that we need to begin to reframe the narratives ourselves, to stop internalizing the dominant narrative that religious folks are primarily the shock troops of the anti-abortion movements, but have in fact been enabling this sea change to happen. If you can't win an abortion ballot in Kansas, where are you going to win it? I mean, we're talking about red Kansas here, one of the Bible Belts. So what does this tell us about the stories we have about faith, and how do we need to modify those stories? Is it folks who are cafeteria Catholics? I don't think it's that simple. So I think we need to recalibrate our academic language and our practical language to understand what is happening around us, which is really, again, a profound sea change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your contributions. I want to lift up another genre of questions that came from our participants here. And this one's coming from Cassia, who joins us from, who is an historian and epidemiologist working on reproductive justice in Brazil, from the colonial period to today. And The question is around a very dominant story and narrative that has become a part of the politicization, the religious politicization of reproductive politics, predominantly in the United States, around later abortion. So it's become a proxy and stand-in for all abortions, although it represents a fairly small minority of those who do seek abortion, but let's not erase those who do have later abortions, of course, at the same stroke. But thinking here about how anti-abortion religious leaders use later abortions and people who seek and need later abortions in ways that might warrant a new story. I want to ask each of you, coming from your own distinct, beautiful perspectives, thinking here, Kimberly as doing pastoral care, taking calls through Faith Aloud with people experiencing crisis, perhaps this might be one of them, how you might counsel on this through an alternative story to the one that a pregnant person might have heard at church or in dialogue with God. Celene, the question might be in thinking about other nuanced interpretations of Islamic law and jurisprudence that might draw bright lines that are not so bright to the people who might need or benefit from a compassionate eye. And of course, here, Gil, thinking with what have you learned in your oral histories of clergy and providers who have certainly been part of providing the care for people at all stages of need, including later abortion seekers?
A benefit of being a Protestant clergy is the ability to say, well, what did Jesus say about it? Right? Right? Let's talk about what he said about it. And so in having conversations with people, wow, I guess over the last almost 20 years now, who have been exposed to and fed so many various narratives about who God is and what God is and what I come back to the very simple elementary premise of, yes, Jesus loves me, this I know, right? That if God, and most folks will say God is love. Okay, well, if God is love, then let's focus on love. Let's put aside what your pastor may say, your partner may say, your parents may say, and let's talk about love. And do you think the God that you are in relationship loves you? Yes. Do you feel like your God wants you to make a loving decision towards yourself and a decision that can impact the rest of your community? Yes. And so in counseling with people, especially in late, and not even only in late term, also those who terminated a pregnancy previously and then had a miscarriage. That's also a conversation where people then come and they feel like, oh, well, now I'm being punished because I terminated and now I and again, I interact with them not in a very clean, sterile environment of we can have an intellectual conversation about it, but in the throes of I am in crisis at this moment. And so the tools that I use are presence. Sorry, Gil, I know you're not a presentist, but I use presence. And I try to identify, dissect where they feel their core of love and connection is with their higher power, and at least leave them in that moment for the brief time that we are together. And hope that offers them at least enough anchoring to be able to trust that the decision that they make will be the decision that they are supposed to make.
I think I'm going to get a little bit passionate here as well. On the question of late term, oftentimes Muslim clergy who are working with the legal frameworks will say things like, the only reason for an abortion after 120 days is essentially certainty of maternal death. That to me, we cannot keep repeating this. It's just incredibly harmful. So I would just, if I could just say one thing, and sort of I'm speaking now to fellow religious leaders, people who are kind of working with me on this issue, we cannot keep that messaging, because then people have all kinds of reproductive health crises, and then have to, in addition to navigating all of the complications of that health crisis, are then also put in a spiritual crisis because they had to seek out medical need. Was I really about to die? I wasn't sure if it was that serious or not. I mean, this is not the way we should be setting people up in this tender moment of their lives. So that's I'm going to just limit it to one thing, because that's my most urgent ask of my kind of fellow pastoral caregivers and folks who are thinking about ethics in conversation with the Islamic tradition.
So I'm going to say that the thought on this, which is to say the prompt was about later term abortions and reckoning with them. And so the thought on this differed across denominations and differed across circumstances. But what was one of the common unifiers was a sense of maternal health. And there was a capacious definition of health, from social and economic to mental to physical. Now, the clergy who I encountered, who I interviewed, the archives, there was a sense that if you're going for a later term abortion, and again, this would happen for a number of reasons. One, and we can argue where later term begins, but oftentimes it was when a wanted pregnancy became a non-viable pregnancy. In most of those cases, by the time you hit the late 60s, there was exceptions for health of the mother, but in some places there wasn't. It was only to save the life of the mother. So you had to seek out medical exceptions, or you had to travel. Most of these clergy recognized that health was paramount, that the already born, the present person, should take priority. This was axiomatic in Jewish thought. It became axiomatic in mainline Protestant thought as well. And so the question became, how do you make those resources available? How do you argue for them? And so the early abortion rights movement was primarily concerned with therapeutic abortions, right? What they called therapeutic exceptions for personal health, for rape, incest, for violence, for minors having it, right? This was the sort of thin edge of the wedge, the sort of least of the asks. But within the thought within religious thought, there was a wide vocabulary for it. One denomination called it the tragic conflict of life with life. And we need to sort of side with those who are already present. Jewish thought basically said the mother's health is paramount, and other denominations had their own vocabulary. Now, how do you reckon with that? How do you offer pastoral care to those who are seeking later term abortions? And this became one of the ways in which they were developing thought over decades. I had the great privilege of interviewing Curtis Boyd, who was offering illegal abortions before Roe and has been offers them till today. His clinic in Texas recently got shut down, and he continues to offer them in another state, I believe in New Mexico. Now, he integrates rituals. He used to be a Baptist preacher. He converted to Unitarianism, and woven into his medical practice was rituals of grieving, rituals of letting go, rituals of self-care. And so what I want to suggest is that within these various traditions, there is already a rich vocabulary of healing, of forgiveness, of grieving, and also of understanding the, we'll call it, wide circumstances, right? The situational ethics of dealing with terminating a pregnancy.
So this begs another question I have, just sort of lifting up and out something that's common across all religious traditions, and is informing of the justice work that RJ leaders and bearers of that tradition do, which is ritual. And I'm wondering, what rituals might we call into the world here that have not yet been centered enough, and or are waiting to emerge earthside? What kind of work do you do? Or do you wish in your personal life, or do you wish to see being done at bigger scale that we might call ritual, but is contributive toward some of these, realizing the vision of reproductive justice?
Gil, I was going to jump in after you said what you said, and then Risa, you just prompted me further. In the Islamic tradition, we find the practice of burying a fetus that is at a certain stage in development. We also find the practice of if there's a stillbirth or the like, that depending on the stage of the pregnancy, then there'll also be a funeral prayer that is prayed as well. And so there is some type of continuity between what we would do for a deceased person who has been, has had some time in the world and the fetus. And so I think caregivers and midwives and the like can think Islamically about what do these rituals look like when we're living as minorities, and how would we, how do we adjust these ancient rituals to our own congregations that tend to be a little bit more scattered, and really how the thing that strikes me about Islamic funeral prayers is the prayer is done at the regular 5 daily time slot in the mosque. So I've attended hundreds of funerals for people I have never met by virtue of praying in that space when a body is brought forward, having just been washed and prepared for internment. But what do these practices look like when you're living in a diaspora population where the whole community is not a support agent, where we're kind of piecing together our own communities? So there's a lot to be done there, I think.
Quickly, also, a way to address this systemically, I think, or at least ecclesiastically, is to include prayers for people who have had miscarriages, for people who have had to terminate, to put that in our books of services or common prayer or whatever those books are, so that at the very least, as new clergy are coming through, they are exposed to that, and those seeds are planted, and they know that that resource is there, even if it's a private, just like we take communion to people in our religion, right? Why can't we take a service, a ritual to say, hey, this pregnancy was just terminated. Now let's acknowledge it. Let's do some comfort, some care. So just to make it a more typical normative part of the rituals that already exist in so many of our religions.
I'll just add very quickly that groups like RCRC, Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and in its previous incarnations would offer books and pamphlets for reproductive healthcare clinics, offering a range of prayers and rituals that people could use, that historically in some clinics, which were either clergy run or clergy on the board, folks were offering pastoral counseling in these clinics. And much of our practice of reproductive healthcare counseling, much of it is seen as secular now, but there was a long and vibrant tradition that continues in some places of that being within the clinic a religious service as well, not in a coercive sense, but as an offering for those who would seek it out. So there is a long tradition, and a deep one, and a multi-faith one of ritual and prayer that has been embedded in that part of the life cycle for many people of having to terminate a pregnancy for any number of reasons.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gil. Really, I've learned so much from all of you, and I think this is such a fascinating interdisciplinary, but also so many different positions that we all take. And I think that people tend to be ritual innovators. So we have historical things, but I think we also need to get creative. And I think these types of conversations that are really bringing together so many different voices is so important. And I really want to thank you all and our participants whose voices we hear on the chat as well. Mickey is going to tell us what we have in store for the rest of this term for you before we thank you all so much. Mickey.
Yeah, thank you all very much again. I've learned a lot. I'm excited now to be in community with you all because of this. I think like some of the praises that you've gotten in the chat about sort of creating new possibilities with your language that you've sort of brought here, as well as opening up people's minds even about religion in a reproductive context, is really great. And I know we have to go, so I'll just quickly talk a little bit about our next conversation, which is scheduled for Tuesday, October 15th, from 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That topic will be on the past and potentials of religion, race, and reproduction with Dr. Lena Maria Murillo and Dr. Elizabeth O'Brien. So we're really excited, and we hope you all can join us for that. And in the last just minute, I just wanted to thank everyone for agreeing to be a part of this, and for those of you who came and sat and listened and learned with us, I'm really grateful as well. Is there anything else that anyone would like to end on? Great. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Again, this will be recorded and dispersed through our networks, and we're very excited and grateful that you all were able to join us. Thank you.